Good morning, everyone. My name is Ibrahim El Karfa, Professor of Applied Linguistics and Semantics at Sidi Mohammed Abdullah University, the Faculty of Letters and Human Sciences, Dhar Mehraz Fez, the Department of English. And welcome to this lecture on semantic theory and modern linguistics. In this lecture, I will talk about 6 points. The first one is the introduction of the shift from historical to modern linguistics and semantics. The second is the school of structuralism, both European and American. The third is the Chomskyan revolution in modern linguistics and the 1960s developments in semantics. And the fourth is defining semantics and its scope. And the fifth is about the aims and areas of concern of a semantic theory. And the sixth is about the characteristics of a semantic theory. Now let me start by introducing the paradigmatic shift from historical to modern linguistics and semantics. As I have explained in the previous lecture, the study of meaning has a long history in philosophy and logic. However, in spite of this long history of philosophers and logicians' interest in questions of meaning, very little progress was made before the late 19th century, and semantics did not really exist as a distinct field before. However, by the end of the 19th century, the French linguist Michel Braille founded semantics or historical semantics and made great efforts to introduce semantics into European linguistic work. As I explained before, the philosophical and historical perspectives that characterized interest in meaning and shaped the emergence of semantics in the 19th century were important factors leading to the basic shift from historical semantics and linguistics to an interest in the structure of language as it exists at a particular time without regard to its historical origins. This shift in theoretical and methodological interest led linguists to concentrate on describing structures of languages without regard to their historical antecedents. This emerging theoretical interest led to the rise in linguistic theory of various structuralist schools, both in Europe and the United States of America. For European structuralism, there is a general agreement that the great pioneer of structuralism was the Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure, whose lectures were published by his students in 1916, 3 years after his death, under the title Cours de Linguistique Générale, in English, Lectures in General Linguistics. And once de Saussure had made the linguistic sign the cornerstone of his influential theories, semantics was introduced as a branch of linguistics, concerned essentially with the synchronic study of meaning within modern linguistics. To illustrate the shift, I quote here de Saussure, who says, "As long as semantics engages in the study of changes in meaning of words at the various stages of their existence, it is in fact historical semantics." For de Saussure argues that it is necessary to originate static semantics, not changeful and developmental historical semantics. Static semantics, which would analyze, systematize, and study pure meanings regardless of historical development. As you can note, this is a clear and explicit criticism against historical semantics introduced by Michel Braille. In the same line of thought outlined by de Saussure, Peter Matthews, in his book A Short History of Structural Linguistics, particularly chapter 7 on structural semantics, Peter Matthews argues that the beginning of semantics lie in Saussure's theory of linguistic science, and he writes how Braille saw this discipline need not concern us. This is a strong reaction against historical semantics on the part of Matthews, who associates the birth of semantics with the emergence of structuralism. Matthews argues that for a structuralist, a language is a system in which determinate forms are related to meanings that are also determinate. Structural semantics for him is concerned with meanings as terms in such systems. Matthews 2001, page 120. In the same line of argument, Alan Cruz, in his important glossary of semantics and pragmatics, explains that the fundamental idea underlying structural semantics as a branch of structural linguistics is that word meanings are historically that is relational, are basically relational. That is to say, a word meaning is determined by the position, its position in a network of semantic relations with other words in this same lexical field. Here we have to underline the notions relational, semantic relations, position in a network. They are relations referred to by the dichotomy, paradigmatic and syntagmatic relations that we will talk about in the next lecture. Contrary to European structuralists, American linguists were comparatively reluctant to consider semantic questions. Structuralists in America came to see the semantic system of a language as a field which was separate from its language, from the central systems of language, and suggested that the investigation of semantics could therefore be postponed. For example, the two principal American linguists in the early 20th century, Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield, although they did not entirely neglect semantic matters, but they had little to say about these matters. The American structuralists of the 1940s and 1950s, that is, successors of Bloomfield, were so pessimistic about the chances of applying linguistic techniques introduced by structuralism successfully to the seeming swamp of meaning. Therefore, they defined linguistics as a field excluding semantics. This reluctance to semantics on the part of American structuralists during the 1940s and the 1950s has been generally noted and documented in the literature on semantics. For example, Ullman comments that it was paradoxical and disturbing to find that many structural linguists are interested in problems of meaning and reluctant to handle them. Ullman, 1957, page 317. Now let me talk about the Chomskyan revolution in modern linguistics and the 1960s developments in semantics. In the 1960s, shortly after the Chomskyan revolution in modern linguistics, introduced in his seminal works Syntactic Structures 1957 and Aspects of the Theory of Syntax in 1965, in these seminal works, Chomsky set the principles of his transformational generative theory and his theoretical grounds in cognitive psychology. For Chomsky, language is not an aspect of human behavior, but a mental fact. It is the cognitive process of internalizing the rules of the native language, rules which exist in the mind. Chomsky is well known as a staunch critic of behaviorism. He shook the theoretical foundations of behaviorist psychology. Here it is important to note that Chomsky is also a structuralist. for his exclusive concern was with the language structures and linguistic competence. This concern with linguistic competence and language as a systematic structure is a characteristic he shares with de Saussure's structuralism, focusing on language. However, Chomsky is a cognitivist structuralist, whereas de Saussure's structuralism was behaviorist in its theoretical underpinning. The innovations and insights brought about by non-Chomsky have had far-reaching influence on linguists' interest in semantic questions and linguistic semantic theory. For example, the emergence of generative semantics based on the assumption that the rules governing the syntactic formation of sentences are conditioned by the semantic rules allowing the interpretation of these sentences. An example of generative semantics, and which is frequently referred to, is the theory of Katz 1972 and the recent development it has gone through since then. Here I will not dwell long on Chomsky's innovations and their implications for linguistic semantics, because we will deal with the montalistic theories of meaning in more detail in part 4 of the course. In the 1960s, in addition to the Chomskyan revolution in the 1960s, great changes and developments in the field of social sciences happened. In the field of semantics, and as an important advance was made during the 1960s. It was the realization that there were two fundamental different types of linguistic meaning. One type of meaning is intrinsic to the linguistic form contained in it, and that it is always present in that form, while the second type of meaning results from the interaction between the linguistic form of an utterance and the context in which it is uttered. The distinction between these two types of linguistic meaning resulted in the definition of semantics as properly the study of the first type, that is, linguistic semantics is concerned with meaning as intrinsic to the linguistic form contained in it, while the second type, that is meaning as the result of the interaction between the linguistic form of an utterance and the context in which it is uttered. This type of meaning falls with the scope of pragmatics. This distinction between pragmatics and semantics contributed to the growth and flourishing of both disciplines. In recent years, approaches to semantics have diversified and proliferated and flourished, and the subject is now one of the liveliest areas in linguistics. This doesn't mean the disappearance of concern with meanings of words and their development, because the study of word meaning, called lexical semantics, has also been extensively developed as a separate discipline. Now, let me explain and define what linguistic semantics is, and what its scope is. Semantics, and here I will present some representative definitions. First definition, semantics is the technical term used to refer to the study of meaning, and since meaning is part of language, semantics is a part of linguistics. So Palmer 1981 limits semantics to linguistics. The second definition is semantics is the systematic study of meaning, and linguistic semantics is the study of how languages organize and express meaning. In this definition, we have the term systematic, that is scientific. Semantics is also defined as the branch of linguistics which studies meaning. Semantics is understood as properly the study of meaning as intrinsic to the linguistic form contained in it. and is always present in that form. Trask 1999, page 217. Picking up the elements making up these representative definitions can help us formulate our own definition of linguistic semantics, which can be articulated and read as: the domain of semantics is limited to linguistic semantics, and its goal is understanding what linguistic meaning is, how it is represented in language, and how we can decode the linguistic message to arrive at meaning. So linguistic semantics aims to determine the meanings of whole linguistic items, such as phrases or sentences, based on the meanings of their parts. However, this is not an addition process it is a process governed by the syntactic and thematic structure of the sentence, as well as we will explain in details while explaining the compositionality principle in the next lecture. For the purposes of this course, we will focus on linguistic semantics and adopt the well-known articulated and coherently formulated definition provided by Frawley, 1992, who writes: linguistic semantics concerns the relation between semantic structure and overt linguistic form. It is about grammaticalization patterns, or how languages organize and express universal semantic space in grammatical form. This definition highlights the relationship between semantics and syntax and strengthens the distinction between linguistic semantics and other neighboring disciplines such as pragmatics, sociolinguistics, discourse analysis, lexical semantics, sociological semantics introduced by Halliday, which have flourished since the 1960s as a result of this advanced clarity in definition, scope, and conceptual constructs. Now I think we have enough context to present major goals, areas of concern, and characteristics of theory in linguistic semantics. Modern views on meaning are based on the assumption that part of the acquisition of language is the acquisition of the meanings that the expressions of this language convey. Thus, the aims of semantic theory, linguistic semantic theory, are first to specify a clear way the various semantic properties and semantic relations of words and sentences in a given language. This identification of such properties and relations involves the need to account for the compositionality principle and the identification of typical concepts such as synonymy, homonymy, parasemy, hyponymy, antonymy, incompatibility, ambiguity, redundancy, anomaly, and so on, accounting for the inherent properties of meaning. In addition to these goals, it should also account for the infinite number of the meaning combinations that expressions may have on the basis of the acquisition of a finite number of semantic rules and principles. The ultimate goal of a semantic theory is to explain the rapidity of language acquisition, viewed as the internalization of a limited number of phonological, syntactic, semantic rules that allow the understanding and production of an infinite number of sentences conforming to these rules. Here it is important to note the influence of Chomsky's theory on linguistic semantics, which is concerned with meaning acquisition. The most important characteristics of linguistic semantic theory are: first, a semantic theory should be maximally constrained, that is subject to theory internal conditions and principles, that it should be coherent. The characteristic of coherence is very important in building up a good theory. Second, semantic rules should aim at distinguishing meaningful sentences from meaningless ones. That is, they should reflect and describe the native speaker's competence. Third, it should represent the meanings of meaningful sentences in a clear and systematic way. Fourth, it must also provide principled explanations. That is, it should be explanatory for various semantic facts. For example, it must explain why certain constructions are semantically well formed while others are not. So here once again we have the description of the native speaker's competence. Fifth, it should be able to account for the various aspects of meaning in a language. Theories of meaning are not concerned with extra semantic aspects of meaning, that is, aspects related to context in which sentences are used. Such extra linguistic aspects of meaning are dealt with within the fields of, for example, sociolinguistics, pragmatics, and as such they fall beyond the scope of linguistic semantics. So the major aspect, to conclude, the major aspects of meaning that a theory of modern semantics should account for are the compositionality principle, denotative versus connotative meaning, semantic fields, and a number of semantic relations, and in addition to syntagmatic versus paradigmatic relations. These principles and concepts will be presented and explained in the next 3 lectures, inshallah. I hope that you find this series of lectures helpful, and thank you very much for your interest.